we will do that and get that done. Trying to think if there's anything else in terms of housekeeping. Really just welcome. Hi Pam, you too. I'm gonna turn off my video camera so that we only have the presenters video showing. So I think that if I go away, that is why. And we'll get started. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dree, to get going on state legislation.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Allison, and thank you everyone who's hopped on the line. So as was mentioned, today we're going to talk about state trends and 2019 transfer legislation that has been introduced as of today. And I want to really emphasize that it is as of today because we are seeing a lot of legislation being introduced on this particular issue. And literally, I was updating the PowerPoint this morning with new bills. We have over 100 pieces of legislation related to youth prosecuted as adults that has been introduced so far, and we know that several legislative sessions have not started yet, or they're just starting this week. So we expect to see many more come across the line pretty soon. And so again, I'm Dree Thomas. I'm the Policy Director with the Campaign for Youth Justice, and I'm here today with my colleague Rachel Marshall. So I'm going to let Rachel kick us off and talk about how the federal policy work around the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act and its reauthorization is impacting the state legislation that we're seeing today.
Thanks, Dree. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. As Dree mentioned, I'm going to kick us off with a federal overview. Just to provide a little bit of history and background for folks who might be newer to the federal side of things. So the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention, or the JJDPA, is the principal program through which the federal government sets standards for juvenile justice systems at the state and local level, providing direct funding for states for research, training, technical assistance, things of that nature. I'm sure there are at least a few folks on the call that receive funding through this act. It was first signed into law by President Ford on September 7th, 1974, and until very recently had last been reauthorized in 2002. And the law remains the only federal statute that sets our national standards for custody and care of youth in the juvenile justice system, and it provides direction and support for state juvenile justice system improvements. So to be eligible for the funds provided under the JJDPA, each state has to comply with 4 core requirements under the Act. So that's the deinstitutionalization of status offenses, or states shouldn't lock up kids for committing status offenses, things like running away from home and truancy. States are required to remove youth from adult and jail lockups. And in the rare instances that youth are kept in adult facilities, they must be sight and sound separated. And states also must take steps to track and address disproportionate minority contact with the juvenile justice system. 16 years after the bill was last reauthorized, Congress finally passed a reauthorization bill, the Juvenile Justice Reform Act of 2018. In December of 2018, it was signed into law on December 21st, 2018, literally right before the 115th Congress went out of session. And this final bill passed by Congress strengthens the national standards by reducing the placement of youth in adult jails pre-trial and providing more structure to the law's requirements to decrease racial and ethnic disparities. That is a critical provision ensuring that children, regardless of their race or ethnicity, will be treated fairly and equitably within the legal system. The bill also promotes the use of alternatives to incarceration, supports the implementation of trauma-informed evidence-based practices. It calls for the elimination of dangerous practices in confinement, including the elimination of the use of restraints on pregnant girls. It improves conditions and educational services for incarcerated youth, and it focuses on the particular needs of special youth populations such as trafficked youth and tribal youth, as well as increasing local control and delinquency prevention programming and increasing accountability. The one update that I want to hone in on that is of particular relevance for this presentation and hopefully the group of people on this phone is the one that you'll see up on the slide. So this is the jail removal core requirement, and the main change to this core requirement under the Juvenile Justice Reform Act of 2018 is that previously the jail removal protection only applied to youth facing delinquency charges, and now under the updated law, states will have 3 years from the time of implementation of the act to remove youth, including those who have been certified as adults, from adult jails, unless the court finds it's in the interest of justice to keep the young person in an adult facility. So in determining whether there is an interest of justice exception, courts will be required to consider 7 factors, including age, the physical and mental maturity of the youth, whether there is imminent harm, the youth's delinquency history, and whether the juvenile detention center has the ability to meet the needs of that particular youth while maintaining the safety of the other youth in its care. The other kind of important caveat is that the Act defines an adult as an individual who has reached the age of full criminal responsibility in that state. So in a state where the criminal age of responsibility is under 18, so the 4 states that have not raised the age of criminal responsibility and the states that are currently in the process of implementing their raised age laws, this provision would not apply to those youth under 18. So there are some 17-year-olds that are transferred to the adult system that wouldn't be, or 17-year-olds that are automatically tried as adults wouldn't be protected by this provision. Right now, a little more than half of states allow youth transferred to the adult system to be held pretrial in juvenile facilities, but others will need to change their laws in the next 3 years to come into compliance. So that's something we'll be monitoring closely, and I know Tree already has some of the states that have been introducing legislation related to that core requirement. And if you're interested in more information, there's a link at the bottom of this slide for those of you on the phone. That's act4jj.org/resources. You can find more information, including the text of the new law, summary that breaks down all of the changes quite nicely, and individual fact sheets on all of these different areas of improvement.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you.
So going off of Rachel's wonderful introduction of how the federal law will impact what we're seeing in the states, I wanted to really just talk about some of the state legislative trends. Now, this was incredibly difficult to group them because there is a lot of legislation. As I mentioned before, over 100 pieces already introduced this session, but I've tried to break up the trends into 8 trends. So today we will start by talking about some jail removal bills, I should say jail and prison removal bills that we're seeing in states. Then I will move on to talk about some bills that are related to raising the age of juvenile court jurisdiction, even in states going beyond 18. Then I will talk about some bills related to the transfer of youth to adult system, both the good and the bad that we're seeing. And then move on to talk about mandatory minimum sentences for youth tried as adults, solitary confinement restrictions for youth who are tried as adults, protections, parole eligibility, and then I would like to finish by talking about some racial impact statement bills that we're seeing. And the reason why I want to really include that is because, of course, transfer is one of the highest points of racial disparity in the juvenile justice system. And so we're starting to see some bills that are trying to get at that particular issue specifically. And I want to really highlight that as we complete the presentation today. All right, so let's start with our first trend, which is jail removal. So this, again, I'm not going to cover all of the legislation that we're seeing, but just want to highlight what a couple states are doing. So in terms of jail removal, we are seeing bills in Washington, Montana, Arizona, Virginia, South Carolina, and South Dakota. That's related to trying to get youth out of either adult jails or other adult facilities. Because of the Juvenile Justice Reform Act of 2018, we expect to see similar legislation also in Florida, and I'm sure in a number of other places that are trying to make sure that their law complies with the new jail removal and sight and sound provisions. But right now, for the most part, what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of states continue to expand on existing laws that they have that have tried to provide some protections for youth, and we see them just continuing to move that further. So, for example, in Washington State, they treat they send many of their committed youth who are tried as adults to their juvenile facilities, but their new law, the bill that they're proposing, would make it so that those youth under 18 who are tried as adults wouldn't even have to get their initial evaluation from an adult facility. They could go to a juvenile facility to get their initial evaluation and then be placed in a juvenile placement. So they're continuing to think about how to make sure that young people do not have to touch adult facilities at any point. So we're seeing that. We're seeing Montana, which is trying to prohibit incarceration of youth in adult prisons. We're seeing in Arizona, there's a bill that's seeking to make it so that youth who traditionally would not be allowed to be in a juvenile detention because they have dangerous offenses, we're seeing an attempt to make it so that those young people can be held in juvenile facilities as well. Seeing some similar things in other states. So as you can see, the states are really taking heed, particularly of this issue of where young people are being held, even if they've been tried as adults. So the next trend involves raise the age. So as Rachel mentioned, there are still 4 states that have not raised the age of juvenile court jurisdiction to 18 or have not passed legislation to do so. Those states are Texas, Michigan, Georgia, and Wisconsin. There are currently bills introduced in Texas to raise the age, so that is positive. And we also anticipate legislation in Michigan and Georgia. Now, Georgia's session just started this week, so the bills haven't popped up yet, but we're expecting to see them pretty soon. And so we're very excited about that. Also wanted to highlight the fact that several states are looking at going beyond 18, and they're starting to study and consider legislation to raise the age beyond. So we know that last year Vermont passed the bill and became the first state in the country to pass legislation to raise their age beyond 18. But this year we're seeing bills in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and also in Illinois. So Illinois' bill specifically is related to raising the age for youth up to 21 with misdemeanor offenses, but we're seeing that legislation there. And then this year we're seeing that Colorado has an interest in this issue. They have a bill to do an age of delinquency study to look into how they could go about raising the age of juvenile court jurisdiction in the future beyond 18. So even though they don't have legislation specifically to do so, they're starting to study the issue, which is positive. Now, on this front, we are seeing one bad piece of legislation related to raise the age this year, and that is that in Connecticut, there is a bill that will attempt to repeal raise the age. We are hopeful that this bill will not go far because there's been a lot of research done on the positive impact that raise the age has had in Connecticut. And in fact, I think there's a bill to study that once again in Connecticut's legislature. But I did want to highlight that there is that one negative bill, but we're hoping that it won't go too far. Great. And we also have some legislation that will hopefully limit transfer of youth to the adult system. In New Jersey, there was a bill that was introduced where they're hoping to expand judicial discretion so that the transfer is no longer mandatory, essentially, for certain offenses. In Virginia, they initially had a bill that would have raised the minimum age of transfer from 14 to 16 years old. Unfortunately, those bills have gone through the committee process, so they have changed a little bit. There were 3 bills filed this year. One of them died in the committee in the House. The other 2 bills, the Senate bills, were drastically whittled down, and so the one that's still really active is a bill that would limit transfer for 14 and 15-year-olds who are charged with felony larceny offenses. So it'd make it so that they would no longer be eligible to be transferred. We're also seeing legislation in Florida and in Mississippi that are very positive in terms of trying to make it so that young people, especially 14 and 15-year-olds, just wouldn't be eligible for transfer or wouldn't be eligible for things like mandatory transfer. So it really is trying to restore some discretion in the decision-making process so that young people are not mandatorily or automatically sent to the adult system. So that is positive. Unfortunately, though, there are still some negative transfer bills out there, some of which have some legs, unfortunately. So in Indiana, there is a bill, SB 279, to expand statutory exclusion by making it so that 12-year-olds could be charged with attempted murder, who are charged with attempted murder would automatically be transferred to the adult system. This legislation comes out of a really unfortunate incident that happened last year at a school where you had a young person who brought a weapon to school. And so because that young person wasn't at the age at which they could be transferred, this legislation came about. It has unfortunately passed the Senate and is going into the House, so we're keeping track of it and hoping to provide any support that we can to address it, because of course we do not want to expand transfer and particularly expand statutory exclusion of young people as young as 12 years old to be put in the adult system. So that is definitely a negative bill that we're keeping our eye on. In Connecticut, we are also seeing a couple of negative bills that could push more young people into the adult system. We're seeing a bill that is essentially a once an adult, always an adult bill, where, once a young person has a felony, if they have another offense and they are over the age of 16, they would automatically be treated as an adult. And then we're also seeing an attempt to make it a requirement that young people are transferred if they have, multiple felonies. And then in Maryland, there is legislation to try to add attempted carjacking and attempted armed carjacking by a 16 or 17-year-old to the very long list of offenses that are already statutorily excluded from juvenile court. So I believe there's a hearing coming up on this bill, I think as early as next week. So we're looking, we're continuing to monitor that and to try to push back against this legislation. But, it's very concerning that a lot of the bills that are related to expanding transfer are specifically trying to make it so that the transfer is either automatic or it's mandatory. So they're trying to create mechanisms where there wouldn't be some initial juvenile court discretion. They're trying to make it so that the kid would start in adult court, and that's definitely a concern. So we're also seeing some legislation related to mandatory minimum sentences for youth who are tried as adults. So these have been generally pretty positive. We're seeing states recognize that it's not appropriate for young people to get mandatory minimum sentences. So in Oregon, there are several bills, but I've included one here that are seeking to repeal the imposition of mandatory minimum sentences on youth under 18. Oregon also has a couple bills that are specifically trying to create some carve-outs for young people so that they aren't given mandatory minimum sentences. Nebraska also has a similar bill to try to eliminate mandatory minimums for young people under 19, actually. And in Hawaii, we see a bill where they're trying to give judges some discretion to impose lesser sentences, particularly on young people who have experienced abuse or trafficking. So they have a bill specifically related to making it so that a court would not have to give a young person a mandatory minimum sentence if there is evidence that they were abused or trafficked. We're also seeing some legislation related to restricting solitary confinement for youth in adult facilities. We're seeing this in Nebraska, in Florida, in New York, in New Jersey, and in Virginia. A lot of these bills also include trying to collect some data as it relates to this issue, but for the most part, it's really focused on trying to protect what they call the vulnerable population, youth, as well as others, so people with mental health issues and others that are in adult facilities, trying to create some parameters to restrict the use of solitary confinement on that population. In Florida, there's a couple bills, and I think that is directly related to litigation that has occurred in Florida because they have had young people in adult jails who really have suffered as a result of the solitary confinement, and so we do see legislation there as a result. So that is definitely positive to see states trying to address that issue, to see so many states trying to address that issue. Next, protections for youth tried as adults. So we are seeing states try to protect this population by either making it so that their cases are sealed, or their records are expunged, are kept confidential in some way. So, for example, in Connecticut, they're trying to make it so that even if a young person is mandatorily transferred to the adult system, that their record is at least, or their case is sealed until there's a decision that they're going to remain in the adult system. We're seeing a similar bill in Maryland where they're trying to keep a lot of the court records confidential until there's a decision that that young person has to remain in the adult system, because if they don't, and if they end up being reverse waived to the juvenile system, they want to make sure that that young person's record is protected. We're also seeing bills related to making it so that young people cannot waive their right to counsel at a certification or transfer hearing. We're seeing that in Missouri in particular. And then in Illinois, we're seeing a push to establish a program to make sure that youth who are charged with offenses, many of which are eligible for transfer, do receive counsel throughout their custodial interrogation. So again, we're starting to see some bills that are trying to get at this issue of protecting young people who are at risk of being transferred or at risk of remaining in the adult court. We're seeing some bills to try to protect that population as well. So the next bills I want to cover are related to parole eligibility for youth who are sentenced as adults. So because of the really great work of groups like the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth and others, there is a lot of pushback, of course, against juvenile life without parole. But we're seeing states go even beyond that and to really start looking at young people who are tried as adults who are getting long sentences, even if they're not life without parole. So we are starting to see states say, well, if a young person under 18 gets a 30-year sentence, for example, we are going to try to do some things to make it so that they're eligible for parole a bit earlier. So we're seeing that in a couple states. So in Arizona and Virginia and Mississippi and in Texas specifically, we're seeing some work to try to make it so that that young people who are sentenced as adults and receive long sentences or life sentences have an opportunity to be eligible for parole. In Texas, they're also looking at making sure that there are specific criteria that are related to youthful offenders specifically, that is added to the parole language so that they get some special consideration in that process as well. Finally, I wanted to talk about the racial impact statement. So as many of you all know, the Sentencing Project did really great work introducing the concept of racial impact statements, I believe initially to the state of Iowa, and then it spread from there. And the idea is that in states that have racial impact legislation or laws, basically, when there is a criminal justice or juvenile justice related bill that gets introduced, if that bill could have an impact on the sentencing or incarceration or parole or anything of that nature, if they impact that, then those bills are required to have some kind of racial impact statement done on them so that there's an acknowledgement if those bills could contribute to greater racial disparities in that state. And so we've seen a lot of different versions of these racial impact statements. Some of them are automatically triggered when bills are introduced. Others require someone to trigger the creation of the impact statement. But overall, it's good to see that states are starting to look at this. More states are starting to look at it. So there are bills in New York, also in Kentucky, in Oklahoma, in Mississippi, and in Minnesota that are focused on trying to create racial impact statements for criminal justice related and juvenile justice related legislation. And again, we think that this could be helpful because transfer is such a point of high racial disparity in the system and the sort of juvenile justice continuum. And so we are hoping that these bills might help to address some of that. So as I mentioned, there are a number of bills and they're rolling in fast. And so in order to keep up with that, the Campaign for Youth Justice is now publishing weekly legislative roundups that we push out through our email contact list every Friday. But you can also find them on our website at www.cfyj.org/statework/weekly legislative roundup. And so I really encourage those on this call, if you are interested in seeing the full picture of legislation that's being introduced, please do check out the legislative roundup or sign up to get those straight into your inbox. So that's all I have for now, and I think we can open it up for questions.
Thanks, Doree. That was a lot and really helpful in terms of getting the lay of the land. I know Josh actually had a question already, so I'm going to, it looks like you've already unmuted yourself, Josh. Do you want to go ahead and pose your question to the group?
Yeah, so Doree, and I guess this is also to anyone in the states that were listed, I'm curious about, out of these bills that were listed, which do you think have the best chance of passing because maybe like an opponent from a prior legislative session has retired or was defeated in a primary? Like what got close in a prior year that you think is close to happening this year?
So I think, well, there's a couple, but a lot of it is based on hunches. So, you know, for some of the raise the age legislation, of course, we're hopeful that particularly the legislation we're expecting in Michigan and Georgia, we're hoping that will move. But of course, that will be up to the legislators to decide. I believe that, and I have to double check, but I believe that the legislation related to limiting solitary in Virginia is moving. On on a negative front, that legislation, that, like as I mentioned, that legislation in Indiana is moving pretty quickly, and again, that's related to that incident that occurred, and so we see that has a lot of political momentum because of that. But it's hard to say. It's still pretty early. There were some bills that I left off because they have already died, unfortunately, and so it's always hard to tell this early on, because some of the bills haven't had their hearings yet, and the ones that have, many of them have quickly kind of resolved. But I don't know if anyone else on the line in the states, again, if you know of legislation in your state that's moving already or moving pretty quickly.
And folks should be able to unmute themselves, but there's also the chat box. I'm happy to unmute people if you're having any issue, but I'm relying on you guys. Are there other questions that folks have, or do folks have thoughts on what you're seeing in your particular state that you want to share with the group? Everyone's very quiet. I can call folks out by state, but really want to give preference to folks who have questions or really want to get some feedback from the presenters. So I can unmute everybody and it can be a frenzy. We could do lots of things.
And I'll say that if folks have questions and want to address them offline, my contact information is on the screen, and I know we're going to send out this PowerPoint so folks have this information, but we're also, I know Rachel and I are both happy to have conversations with folks offline specifically about your state, and for example, if you're wondering how the JJDPA changes, particularly around jail removal, is going to impact your state, definitely do reach out to us.
Yeah.
And we did get one question from Ria. So she asked whether or not we've seen any of the states that have passed legislation on racial impact statements. I'm sorry, I'm misphrasing her question. So what states have already passed racial impact statements and whether they've had any impact on disparities. I have a couple thoughts, but I don't know if you have reflections, Street.
So this is actually probably a better, I don't know if Josh knows, because I know the Sentencing Project has really led the charge on this. I'm happy to send around some materials that I believe Nicole Porter has published on the states that sort of have started to work on this legislation. I know for a fact that Iowa has passed legislation. I believe, I want to say that New Jersey as well, Oregon, and I believe potentially Washington State. And I want to say, I know that I'm missing a few others that have developed some policies, but I'm happy to send along the list that I know, or some research that I know has happened so far. So I don't know if there's been a ton of research done specifically on the impact. I've seen one law review article on the impact, as well as another article on Iowa specifically, because it is the state that has had a racial impact statement for the longest period of time. I believe in what I've read about the Iowa one was that it did have some moderate impact on whether or not a bill passed when people saw that it negatively impacted, impacted people of color. It became a little less likely that those bills would pass. And so we are starting to see that. But in terms of having an impact on the sort of the prison population or things of that nature, I think that's somewhat the limitation of the impact statement. And I've read some about that. So I'm happy to share some additional resources that I found about the benefits of it, and then opportunities to continue to utilize those impact statements to push beyond that. So I'll share those after this call.
Thanks, Doree. And my list was similar to yours, and New Jersey did pass theirs. So it would pass last year. Happy to connect folks on the phone with our advocates there who helped move it. And Josh is telling me that Nicole Porter at the Sentencing Project is the right person to contact. So we have information from her too. I think she did a webinar with us. So we're happy to share what we have. Any other questions from folks? It looks like a few other folks are unmuted, so I don't know if you have a question you want to pop in with.
Hey, this is Josh. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, great. I'm curious about the impact of car theft. Sort of, there's a lot of very specific things that were being mentioned, and I don't know the criminal law and the criminal code in each of these states, but when you say felony 1C, to what extent is this being driven by concerns about car theft? I know that seems to come up in Connecticut and Florida a lot. Anywhere else that people are freaking out over that?
Well, Maryland. So that bill that we're seeing in Maryland that's trying to add the attempted carjacking and things of that nature. So we are seeing that in states where they are carving out particular offenses that they're starting to see and trying to add those to the list of things that can be statutorily excluded or mandatorily transferred. We are seeing that happen a little bit, but as of right now, again, generally things are moving positively, but we are seeing a couple of states starting to introduce those types of bills. So like Maryland, Connecticut, and Indiana.
So not to be too sarcastic or anything, but isn't it already illegal to steal a car with a gun in like Maryland? Like, isn't that already against the law?
Right. Right. It's just a matter of whether or not it results in the young person being automatically transferred to the adult system, right? So what we're seeing is that the states that are trying to make their transfer laws more harsh are doing that by making it so that the young people are automatically tried as adults. So instead of letting them have any discretion at the juvenile court level, the ones that are making things worse are really making it so that the kid they're automatically placed there. And so that's definitely really troubling.
And the only other thing I would add to Josh, and this has not been this legislative session, but last year we saw a huge push legislatively for around car theft in Illinois. There was a lot of policy level changes in large cities in New Mexico as well, and then Wisconsin also had issues around it. And so we put together a fact sheet just for our advocates to push back around. Really, to Doree's point, the push in all of the states was to make sure that these young people were either considered more serious offenders or that they were automatically charged as adults. And so trying to elevate other restorative justice practices or other community-based solutions or environmental health tactics. So trying to remember the exact language of it, but we can share the tip sheet with anybody who's interested as well.
Great.
Other questions from folks? I know we've got folks all over the country. I know Missouri is on and California, New Jersey's on too. So I don't know if anyone, Kansas, just want to allow folks in the state to elevate anything you might be saying for folks at SPLC. I did get one other comment. So I'm going to read it, but if anyone has a question, jump in while I'm trying to get a handle on it. So sorry, it was a long comment from Anna actually, but the question is, so in the development of the various bills, particularly the progressive bills, that what has been, I'm butchering this a little bit, so sorry, the impetus around racial disparities. So for example, in California, when they advocated for 1391, which eliminated the transfer of 14 and 15-year-olds to adult court, I know it's been too early on that bill, but she's asking whether we were able to show that there was a highly disparate impact on Black and Latino 14 and 15-year-olds, and that's why the legislation moved, or have we been able to show that that's had a positive effect on kids of color? So Anna, I don't know if you want to hop in. I kind of butchered your question, but I think I got the just a bit, but please clarify if I missed it.
So I will just hop in to say that I do believe that and I'm sure there's folks on the line who could speak more to this. I do believe that they did utilize the data that they had on the impact, the racial disparate impact of transfer. I believe they did use that in the push in California, and I know in a lot of our states we do have that data as a result of the JJDPA, right? There's some data on the DMC and now racial and ethnic disparities, and there's going to be more as a result of the reauthorization. So there's going to be some opportunities for advocates to utilize that data collection to make some of those arguments. I don't think as of yet there's been a study on the impact of that law in California, meaning what we're seeing now as a result, but I'm sure that we probably will start to get that as a full sort of year's data is collected on sort of after the implementation of the law.
Thanks. And I know Michael Mendoza's on. Sorry to call you out, but I know you're in California. So I was wondering, I know you did a lot of work on that bill specifically. Was there a racial analysis in moving that legislation forward?
Hi, yes, this is Michael. So as Anna mentioned, there was data in terms of racial disparity used in the support of this bill while we were passing. It was very, very, very helpful. I guess if I can give any updates of where we're currently at with SB 1391, in partnership with Elizabeth Calvin and Human Rights Watch, we are really trying to focus on the implementation. Currently in over 8 different counties, there are a lot of challenges against SB 1391 in terms of constitutionality, or the fact that a lot of the youth who have cases out in different counties that might benefit for 1391, they're really being dehumanized through very negative articles. A lot of times, the points that are being missed is the fact that most of these kids who have made bad decisions at such a young age will either traumatize themselves and just other points. And so at the moment, Elizabeth Calvin has an amazing team that is keeping track. And so we're trying to figure out ways around messaging to respond to these articles, and whether we should respond, because so far it seems to have worked in terms of not responding, because when we've experienced that when we have responded to these negative articles, a lot of the oppositional arguments at times have been highlighted more than supporting views. And so that's currently something that we're working on in the moment to really support the implementation of this bill and how it's working. And maybe would love to hear more thoughts around how to support legislation in certain states that are really being opposed in the courts.
Yeah. So that's I'm so glad that you're on the line and could speak to the importance of implementation of legislation, because of what we're seeing in the states, and there are some legislators that are trying to go back to that tough on crime framework, there's a real need for advocates to try to make sure that the wins are sustained and actually implemented, because there is definitely a risk of pushback, especially by prosecutors and law enforcement and other legislators who get concerned and try to figure out ways to overcome really great reforms in their states. So it is important to strategize around that. I know I have been working with some folks on talking about sort of the intersections of transfer litigation and legislation. And if there's folks on this call that want to be a part of that conversation, I definitely would love to have you all as a part of that. So I'll send out some information. Please do contact me if you want to be a part of that larger sort of brainstorming around how do we talk about, how do we message, and how do we strategize around the passage of legislation and then litigation that occurs, or vice versa, on this issue, and how do we make it so that good reforms don't get pushed back.
And just to also build on what Sheree had said about the JJDPA, as she mentioned, that core protection has been strengthened. It's now, instead of disproportionate minority contact, racial and ethnic disparities, so that it really encompasses where the disparities are in the juvenile justice system. But as I'm sure, as many of you know, not only have we seen this kind of reemergence of the super predator and tough on crime narrative in the states, we've also seen it coming from this administration. And Karen Harp, who is the administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention in particular, and specifically related to that core protection, because there are not currently regulations around that core protection. The agency has had a lot of leeway in how they enforce that, and last year they decided to loosen the compliance requirements. And so as we move into the implementation phase of the JJDPA, that's something we're really going to need to make sure we're holding OJDP's feet to the fire, and to ensure that they are implementing the changes to the law in good faith. And so I think, to the extent advocates in the state can be talking about why this data is important and how it helps them, that's going to be key. And as we learn more about what the regulatory process will look like, we'll be sure to keep folks in the loop, because I think having states weigh in is going to be a critical part of that.
Thanks. And I just to sort of sew up this question, because I did get a little bit of more clarification from Anna. She was aware of the analysis in California, but was trying to get a sense on what other states have been doing a similar racial analysis when pursuing policies. And so I know I've had conversations with folks in Texas who do that, and we've done a couple of trainings here at NJJN for our members to engage in that process when they're moving policies forward. But I don't know, Julie or Rachel, if there's any states that particularly jump out at you that if Anna's interested, we could connect her with.
I'm trying to think. I know that it definitely comes up in a number of states in different ways. I was just thinking, I know that we have been working with, or I've been working with the DMC coordinator, or former DMC coordinator in Iowa, specifically on this issue and on the racial disparity issue, and so that's come up in some of our work. But I know that in many states, because again, this is such a high area of racial disparities, we are seeing that be one of many sort of the arguments that are used to push back against bad legislation.
Thank you. And it looks like we have about 4 more minutes. So is there one final question that folks have? Anyone else have a burning question they want to raise with the group?
Hi, I'm sorry. This is Michael again. Not really a question, more of a request. So hopefully we can just keep in touch offline in terms of, a request of support, maybe through this national platform that can kind of uplift the implementation of SB 1391 in California. Just understanding the importance of this bill and how it can really impact other states. Would really look forward to connecting with folks here after this call, and how we can collaborate with some powerful messaging to help support this implementation here in California.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. Definitely. I'll follow up with you, because I know that in my office, we've already been talking about how critically important it's going to be for us to figure out how to best document what has happened in California, because you guys have had a lot of really positive reforms, and we want to make sure that people learn from that and learn sort of the ins and outs of what happened, and that could be a useful resource for others. So definitely want to connect with you on that, and want to support you in and maintaining and sustaining that victory through any communication support that we can provide.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have the sort of next steps as sharing out the car theft document, as well as providing folks who are on the call with more information about racial impact statements, which Dree, you and I can put our brains around what's best to share and connect with Nicole Porter, connect the group, Nicole Porter. And then we'll share out the slides that Dree has worked from, which includes the awesome link to this legislative roundup from CFYJ, and the contact information for both Rachel and Dree. Is there anything else? I heard your request, Michael, and I wonder if there's any other requests from folks on the phone in terms of follow-up resources. Dree, anything you think I missed that we should share, or Rachel, anything else we should share?
I think you covered it all, but I'll definitely try to make sure that I've encapsulated some other things in our follow-up email to folks, because again, if there is interest in continuing the conversation specifically around the intersections of transfer litigation and legislation, I do want to offer people an opportunity to be a part of that. I know I think our next conversation will be in March, and so I'll send around some information about that as well.
Yeah, and again, feel free to reach out to me if anyone is interested in learning more about what the changes to the JJDPA might mean for their states. If you use the link from the slide about the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, there's a lot of information, and we're working on creating more, including hopefully some documents that can be used to direct states on how they can take action within the states to make sure that the changes in the law are being fully implemented. And I'm always happy to talk offline more about those.
Great, thank you both. And just on behalf of everyone on the call and GGN, I want to thank you both for sharing this awesome information, as well as all of your time with us. And we'll follow up and make sure to share all these awesome resources with folks, and keep going, really. So thanks, everybody, and we will be in touch. And if there's any additional questions that pop up in the meantime, feel free to email me or Rachel or Dree. We'll be sure to get them to the right person. So thanks, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.